Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Moundsville, West Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing to which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The West Virginia State Penitentiary in Moundsville stood as a monument to Gothic architecture and human suffering. Built in 1876, by 1902, the prison had already developed a reputation for its harsh conditions and the stoic resilience of those who worked within its stone walls. Among the staff were three women who became known in prison records only as the Canteen sisters, Margaret, Ruth, and Eleanor Peyton. They weren't actual sisters by blood, but distant cousins who had come to work at the prison's food service after the death of their respective husbands. Between 1899 and 1902, prison records show an unusual pattern, a significant decrease in disciplinary incidents among inmates who regularly ate at times when the Peyton women were working. Administrators praised this as evidence of their calming influence. Yet prison medical logs from the same period documented a curious increase in what was dismissed as digestive ailments among the inmate population. When Dr. James Whitaker, the prison physician, began noting correlations between these incidents and specific meals, he was transferred to a facility in Charleston within weeks. His replacement, Dr. Francis Coleman, made no such notations in his reports. What's peculiar is that despite numerous inmates falling ill during this period, none of the prison staff, including guards who ate the same food but from different serving stations, ever reported similar symptoms. According to records in the Moundsville Municipal Archives, when questioned about this discrepancy in 1903, Warden Samuel Davis stated simply, "Some men's constitutions are weaker than others. Prison life takes its toll." The matter was considered closed. But one detail remained unexplained. In his personal journal discovered decades later, Dr. Whitaker noted that several deceased inmates had shown unusual traces of what he described as floral particulates in their digestive tracts, substances that had no place in the standard prison diet of the time. The prison routine in 1902 Moundsville was rigidly structured like the limestone blocks that formed its imposing walls. Inmates rose at 5:30 a.m. to the sound of bells that echoed through the cell blocks, their metallic resonance penetrating even the deepest sleep. By 6:15, they would file into the mess hall in orderly lines, separated by cell block and criminal classification. The Peyton women would already have been at work since 4 a.m., preparing what passed for breakfast in the dim light of the canteen kitchen. Margaret, the eldest at 48, supervised the operation with tight-lipped efficiency. According to staff logs, she rarely spoke above a whisper, yet somehow commanded absolute authority in her domain. Ruth, 41, managed inventory and supplies, maintaining meticulous records of everything that entered or left the kitchen. Eleanor, the youngest at 37, was primarily responsible for the actual preparation of meals, often experimenting with ways to make the bland prison staples more palatable. Local newspapers occasionally mentioned the Peyton women in passing, noting their charitable dedication to improving conditions for the inmates. The Marshall County Gazette from April 1900 quoted Warden Davis praising their work. "The Peyton ladies bring a touch of home to men who have forgotten what that means." The women lived together in a small house on Jefferson Avenue, a 15-minute walk from the penitentiary. Neighbors described them as private but cordial. Mrs. Abigail Thornton, who lived next door until 1904, told the Gazette, "They keep to themselves mostly. Sometimes I hear them in their garden late at night. They grow the most beautiful nightshade I've ever seen." Prison guard Thomas Reeves noted in his personal correspondence that the Peytons often brought in fresh herbs and vegetables from their garden to improve the wretched prison fare. He observed that inmates would become unusually docile on days when the sisters prepared what they called their special stew. The town of Moundsville itself existed in the shadow of the penitentiary. With approximately 8,000 residents in 1900, It was a community where everyone recognized the sound of the prison bells, where conversations would pause momentarily at the distant sound of the siren that occasionally signaled an escape attempt. The prison employed many local men as guards, creating a culture where prison business was town business. Yet even in this close-knit community, the Peyton women remained somewhat enigmatic. They attended the Methodist Church on Sundays, made their necessary purchases at Lyons General Store, and were seen posting letters at the Moundsville post office with surprising frequency. The postmaster later recalled that these letters were always addressed to the same recipient in Philadelphia, a Dr. Ellsworth Chambers, whose connection to the women was never established. Everything changed on October 17, 1902. According to prison records, that morning began like any other. The Peyton women arrived before dawn, Margaret nodding curtly to the night guard as she signed the staff ledger. What made this day different was the arrival of Inspector Howard Mitchell from the West Virginia Department of Corrections. His visit was unannounced, a new policy implemented after allegations of advance notice undermining proper inspections. Mitchell, a former military man with a reputation for thoroughness, had been appointed just 3 months prior. The official purpose of his visit was a routine inspection, but as his personal papers, discovered during the courthouse renovation of 1958, would later reveal, he had received an anonymous letter alleging unnatural practices in the prison kitchen. Mitchell arrived just as breakfast was being served. Contemporary accounts describe him standing at the entrance to the mess hall, observing the routine with narrowed eyes. Guard Samuel Wilson's journal entry from that day notes, "The inspector watched the Peyton women like a hawk watches field mice. Miss Eleanor's hands trembled so badly she dropped a ladle, splashing stew across her apron." According to Wilson, Mitchell approached the serving line and, breaking protocol, requested to be served from the same pots as the inmates, rather than from the separate portions usually reserved for staff and visitors. Eleanor allegedly hesitated, looking to Margaret, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. What happened next is documented in Mitchell's official report. "Upon tasting the food prepared for inmates, I detected an unusual flavor, something herbal yet bitter. When questioned, Miss E. Peyton stated it was just savory and thyme. I requested to inspect the kitchen ingredients. Mitchell's subsequent search of the kitchen pantry yielded nothing unusual at first, but when he insisted on examining the sisters' personal effects, a small cabinet kept locked near the back entrance, Ruth Peyton reportedly became distressed, claiming he had no authority to access their private property. Mitchell disagreed. When the cabinet was opened, it contained several small cloth bags filled with what Mitchell described as botanical specimens, not consistent with normal culinary use. He confiscated these items for further examination. By noon, all 3 Peyton women had been removed from kitchen duty pending investigation. 3 days later, they failed to report for work. When officials visited their Jefferson Avenue home, they found it empty, with no indication of where the women had gone. The house was described as meticulously clean, as if prepared for inspection. The only unusual item noted was a collection of pressed flowers in a book on the parlor table, specimens that a local pharmacist later identified as belonging to several plants with known medicinal properties, including foxglove and belladonna. The disappearance of the Peyton women prompted surprisingly little official concern. Warden Davis, when interviewed by the Wheeling Intelligencer on October 25, 1902, characterized the situation as a simple case of staff turnover. "These women were not prisoners," he stated. "They were at-will employees who chose to seek opportunities elsewhere. We wish them well." This placid response raised few eyebrows at the time. Prison employees came and went with regularity, and the Peytons had no family in Moundsville to raise questions about their sudden departure. The items confiscated by Inspector Mitchell were sent to a laboratory in Pittsburgh for analysis, but the results, if they were ever returned, do not appear in any official prison records. Mitchell himself was reassigned to the eastern part of the state in November 1902, his brief tenure at Moundsville ending without public comment. The new kitchen staff, led by Mrs. Dorothea Jenkins, introduced a revised menu that was described in administrative memos as simpler and more economical. Prison physician Dr. Coleman reported a statistical normalization of digestive complaints by December 1902, though he attributed this to seasonal variations rather than dietary adjustments. The matter might have ended there, relegated to a minor administrative hiccup in the prison's long history, except for one curious development. In January 1903, the body of an unidentified man was discovered in the Ohio River near Wheeling, approximately 10 miles north of Moundsville. According to the coroner's report, the man had been dead for at least several weeks, making precise identification difficult. What drew the case into the orbit of the Peyton mystery was a soggy notebook found in the victim's coat pocket. Though much of the writing had been rendered illegible by water damage, several pages contained what appeared to be observations about the Moundsville prison kitchen. One partially legible entry read, "Confirm my suspicions about the P women. The effects on prisoners suggest a systematic requires further observation. Tomorrow I will confront." The coroner determined the cause of death to be drowning, though he noted unusual abrasions on the victim's wrists and ankles. The Wheeling police initially investigated the case as a potential homicide, but closed it as an accidental drowning when no witnesses or further evidence emerged. The body was buried in an unmarked grave in the Wheeling Potter's Field after no one claimed it. Curiously, Inspector Mitchell's personnel file indicates he requested information about this case in February 1903, but there is no record of a response. By March, public interest in both the Peyton women and the unidentified body had waned. The prison appointed permanent replacements for the kitchen staff, and the administrative records show a return to routine operations. In his annual report for 1903, Warden Davis mentioned the food service only to note improvements in cost efficiency, with no reference to the previous staff or the brief investigation of their practices. Time passed, as it always does, erasing urgency and dulling curiosity. The corridors of the West Virginia State Penitentiary continued to echo with the same sounds: keys turning in locks, boots on stone floors, occasional shouts or sobs quickly silenced. Spring turned to summer, then autumn, then winter, for years that blended together in the institutional rhythm that governed such places. The story of the Peyton women might have faded completely from memory, if not for a series of unusual deaths that occurred between 1904 and 1906. Prison mortality records, maintained with bureaucratic precision, show that during this 24-month period, 11 inmates died of what was classified as natural causes or complications of existing conditions. This was not, on its face, unusual for a facility housing over 800 men in conditions that would be considered inhumane by modern standards. What drew attention, decades later, was the age and previous health status of these men. None was over 40 years old. None had documented pre-existing health conditions serious enough to explain sudden death. And according to a notation made by a clerk named William Sutter, 8 of the 11 had been kitchen workers who handled food storage or preparation. Sutter's observation appears as a marginal note in the mortality log, almost as an afterthought. Curious pattern among kitchen assignees. Perhaps investigate food storage conditions? There is no record that such an investigation ever took place. The physical deterioration of the prison itself seemed to accelerate during these years. Maintenance reports from 1905 describe persistent dampness in the walls, mold in food storage areas, and an unidentifiable odor in the kitchen that resists normal cleaning procedures. Guard rotation requests show an increasing reluctance to accept assignments in the kitchen or adjacent areas. One guard, Joseph Merrick, requested transfer after only 2 weeks of kitchen duty, citing disturbing dreams and a sense of being watched. His request was granted without comment. Inmates assigned to kitchen duty after lights out reported hearing noises they described as whispering or soft laughter when no one else was present. These reports were dismissed as attempts to avoid work assignments or typical prison superstition. The physical logs of the prison show that between 1904 and 1907, the kitchen was relocated twice within the facility, each time for stated reasons of improved efficiency or modernization. Former guard Harold Pierce, in an interview conducted in 1951 for an oral history of the penitentiary, offered a different perspective. We moved that kitchen because men wouldn't work in the old one, called it the sisters' room, said they could smell flowers there at night, even in winter. Grown men, hardened criminals, afraid to go in after dark. The interview notes indicate that Pierce refused to elaborate further, saying only, "Some things, even after all these years, are better left alone." From the handwritten memoir of Thomas Blackwood, inmate number 6712, discovered in 1959 during renovations of the cell block where he was housed from 1899 to 1907. I worked the late shift in food preparation for 3 years before it happened. The Peyton women, they liked me, said I had careful hands. Miss Margaret would sometimes slip me an extra piece of bread. Not out of kindness, I don't think. She was studying me, like how a man studies a horse he's thinking of buying. They had their favorites among us. Men who got special treatment, extra food, better cuts of the tough meat we were served. I noticed those men changed over time, became quiet, docile. Some had tremors in their hands. When I mentioned this to Miss Ruth once, she smiled and said, "They're just finally finding peace, Thomas." I knew better than to ask more questions. We all did. The night before they disappeared, I was scrubbing pots after dinner service. The sisters thought everyone had gone, but I was still there, hidden behind the large stock pots. They were talking freely for once, not in their usual whispers. Miss Eleanor was upset. "He knows," she kept saying. "Mitchell suspects." Miss Margaret was calmer. "Then we accelerate the final phase," she said. "We have enough specimens now." Specimens. That's the word she used. Miss Ruth asked about the formula and whether it was ready. "Almost," said Miss Margaret. "Dr. Chambers believes we're close to stabilization." Then Miss Eleanor said something that still chills me. "What about the disposal problem?" And Miss Margaret answered, "The stew takes care of that." I dropped a ladle then, and they fell silent. I pretended I'd just returned from the washroom. Miss Margaret watched me closely for the rest of the evening. The next day, they were gone. A week later, I was reassigned to laundry duty. I considered myself lucky. 3 men who worked in the kitchen around that time became violently ill. 2 died. The official report said it was typhoid, but I saw them before they went to the infirmary. That wasn't any typhoid I've ever seen. Their eyes, something was wrong with their eyes, like they could see things the rest of us couldn't. They kept talking about the sisters coming at night. One of them, Joey Malone, scratched his own eyes out before he died. I kept my head down after that. Never spoke of what I heard. When they moved the kitchen the first time, I was asked to help with the cleaning. Behind the big flour bins, where they'd kept their special ingredients, I found a small cloth doll made from what looked like prison uniform fabric. It had no face, just a red smear where the face should be. I burned it that night in the furnace. Maybe that's why I'm still alive to write this down. I've never told anyone until now. But I'm dying anyway. The doctor says it's cancer, so what harm can it do? If you're reading this, know that whatever was happening in that kitchen didn't end when the Peyton women left. It just went underground, like water finding cracks in stone. God help whoever finds where it surfaced. In 1927, 25 years after the Peyton women vanished from Moundsville, a young historian named Catherine Lawson arrived at the West Virginia State Archives in Charleston. According to her research notes, she was working on a dissertation about the role of women in correctional institutions during the Progressive Era. Lawson's academic focus quickly narrowed to the West Virginia State Penitentiary, and specifically to fragmentary references she found to the Peyton women. Her research journal, preserved in the Marshall University Special Collections, documents her growing fascination. June 12, 1927, found reference to Peyton sisters in prison employment records. Curious discrepancy in termination documentation, listed both as resigned and position terminated with different dates. Need to investigate further. Lawson spent weeks combing through administrative records, newspaper archives, and court documents. Most yielded little information beyond what was already known. 3 women who worked in the prison kitchen for approximately 3 years, then disappeared following some kind of investigation. But in August 1927, Lawson discovered something unexpected. In a box of miscellaneous correspondence related to the prison, she found several letters written by Inspector Howard Mitchell to the West Virginia Attorney General's office in early 1903. These letters had apparently never received responses, or if they had, those responses were not preserved. Mitchell's increasing frustration is evident in his tone. August 21, 1927, Mitchell's third letter, dated March 18, 1903, practically begs for attention. I must again urge you to consider the material evidence collected at Moundsville last October. The laboratory analysis confirms the presence of several concerning substances, including derivatives of Atropa belladonna and Digitalis purpurea, neither of which has any legitimate place in food preparation. Furthermore, the subsequent death of my informant under suspicious circumstances suggests a matter more serious than mere improper food handling. I believe the Peyton women may have been conducting unauthorized experiments on inmates with the tacit approval of certain officials who have since impeded my investigation. Lawson's notes indicate she immediately sought to locate Mitchell himself, only to discover he had died in 1917. His personal papers had been donated to the State Historical Society by a niece who had little knowledge of her uncle's career. When Lawson examined these papers in September 1927, she found a journal containing what appeared to be Mitchell's private thoughts about the Moundsville investigation. Mitchell's journal suggests he believed the Peyton women were systematically testing plant-derived compounds on inmates, observing their effects, and documenting the results. He references correspondence between Margaret Peyton and a Dr. Ellsworth Chambers of Philadelphia, describing promising results with subjects 7 through 12, and discussing refined delivery methods that mask both taste and immediate symptoms. Mitchell speculates that Warden Davis was aware of these activities, but permitted them because they resulted in a more manageable prison population. Most disturbing is Mitchell's belief that some of these experiments proved fatal, with the evidence disposed of through what he cryptically refers to as incorporation into the general food supply. This suggests, I can hardly bring myself to write it, a form of forced cannibalism as a disposal method. At this point, Lawson's research notes show a gap of several weeks. When they resume in late October 1927, her tone has changed dramatically. I am being followed. Yesterday, a man in a gray suit asked my landlady questions about my research. My room was searched while I was at the archives. Nothing was taken, but my papers had been moved. I'm sending copies of my notes to Professor Harrington for safekeeping. If anything happens to me, this record will survive. On November 8, 1927, Catherine Lawson checked out of her boarding house in Charleston and purchased a train ticket to Cincinnati. She never arrived at her destination. Her disappearance was reported by Professor Edward Harrington of Ohio State University when she failed to attend a scheduled meeting to discuss her dissertation. A police investigation found no trace of Lawson after she boarded the train. Her luggage was never recovered. The copies of her research notes that she had sent to Harrington became the only remaining record of her work. Harrington placed these materials in the university's restricted archives, where they remained largely untouched until 1946. What Lawson could not have known during her investigation was that her inquiries had triggered interest from multiple quarters. Records from the Philadelphia College of Medicine and Surgery, uncovered in 1951, reveal that Dr. Ellsworth Chambers had indeed been a faculty member there from 1897 to 1904, specializing in what was then called neurochemical research. Chambers' publication history shows a particular interest in compounds that affected the human nervous system, especially those derived from plants. In 1904, Chambers abruptly resigned his position, citing an opportunity to continue my research in a private capacity. College records indicate he received substantial funding from an anonymous donor shortly before his departure. Attempts to trace Chambers after 1904 lead to conflicting information. A death certificate exists for an Ellsworth Chambers in Baltimore, dated October 1905, listing cause of death as respiratory failure. However, passport records show someone of the same name departing from New York to Liverpool in January 1906. Most intriguingly, a small scientific journal published in Vienna in 1909 contains an article on behavioral modifications through botanical neurotoxins, authored by an E. Chambers and M. Peyton. The article details experiments with various plant compounds and their effects on institutionalized subjects, though it is careful not to specify the nature of the institution or the legal status of these experiments. The journal ceased publication after 2 issues, and no further articles by either author have been discovered. During the renovations of the old Moundsville post office in 1932, workers discovered a cache of undelivered mail from the early 1900s that had apparently fallen behind a sorting cabinet. Among these was a small package addressed to Dr. Ellsworth Chambers in Philadelphia, with a return address at the Jefferson Avenue house once occupied by the Peyton women. The package was opened by postal inspectors who found it contained only a small notebook filled with what appeared to be encoded entries and pressed flower specimens. This item was forwarded to the Postal Inspection Service, but was subsequently lost in transit. The full scope of what happened at Moundsville between 1899 and 1902 began to emerge only in 1953, when construction workers renovating the prison's east wing made a grisly discovery. Behind a sealed wall in what had once been part of the original kitchen, they found a small chamber, approximately 6 feet square. The room contained 3 items: a metal table bolted to the floor, a chair with restraints attached to its arms and legs, and a cabinet containing dozens of small glass vials and notebooks. Prison officials immediately contacted the state police, who sealed the area as a potential crime scene. The subsequent investigation, led by Detective Robert Caldwell, produced findings so disturbing that the full report was classified and stored in the state's restricted archives until 1967. According to the portions of the report that were made public, the notebooks contained detailed records of experiments conducted on at least 32 prisoners over a 3-year period. The subjects were identified only by numbers, but their reactions to various treatments were documented in clinical detail. Chemical analysis of residue in the vials identified compounds derived from numerous toxic plants, including belladonna, digitalis, and several varieties of mushrooms indigenous to the Ohio Valley. Most disturbing were references to tissue integration and recycling of failed subjects. Detective Caldwell's personal notes, released after his death in 1962, contain his unvarnished assessment. What we found suggests that the Peyton women were conducting systematic experiments on prisoners, apparently aimed at developing compounds that could alter behavior, specifically compounds that would render subjects docile and compliant. Their notes refer to perfect chemical control as the ultimate goal. When subjects died, and many did, the evidence suggests their remains were processed in some way and introduced into the food served to other inmates. The level of detail in their records regarding the effects of consuming this enriched protein on the unsuspecting prisoners indicates this was itself another avenue of research, perhaps investigating prion diseases or similar conditions. This represents one of the most calculated and horrific violations of human rights I have encountered in my career. The fact that prison officials must have been aware of and apparently sanctioned these activities makes this case all the more appalling. Following Detective Caldwell's investigation, state officials faced a difficult decision: how to handle information that would not only horrify the public but raise serious questions about institutional oversight and responsibility. The discovery came at a particularly sensitive time, as the state was defending itself against lawsuits alleging inhumane conditions at several of its facilities. According to internal memos from the governor's office, obtained through Freedom of Information requests in the 1960s, the decision was made to minimize public exposure to the Moundsville findings. The hidden room was resealed, its entrance concealed by new construction. The notebooks and other evidence were transferred to state archives under restricted access protocols. A small committee of officials was formed to identify any living persons who might have been directly affected by the experiments, either as subjects or unwitting consumers of the contaminated food. This committee worked in secret from 1953 to 1955, using prison records to trace former inmates who had been housed at Moundsville during the relevant period. Their findings were sobering. Of 837 men who had been incarcerated there between 1899 and 1902, an unusually high percentage had died while still in prison or within 5 years of release. Many others showed symptoms consistent with neurological damage or chronic digestive disorders. The committee arranged for discreet medical examinations of 17 living former inmates, all of whom showed unusual neurological symptoms. These examinations confirmed the presence of toxins consistent with those found in the hidden laboratory. The state quietly established a special medical fund to provide care for these men, disguised as a general program for elderly former prisoners. As for the Peyton women themselves, the investigation yielded only fragmentary information. Immigration records showed that 3 women matching their descriptions had sailed from New York to Liverpool in December 1902, traveling under the names Mary, Jane, and Elizabeth Smith. British records showed no trace of them after their arrival. However, in 1912, a private clinic outside Vienna was briefly investigated by Austrian authorities for conducting experimental treatments on patients without proper consent. The clinic was operated by 3 women identified in police reports as English or American. Before the investigation could be completed, the clinic was destroyed in a fire that claimed the lives of all staff and patients present. Austrian newspapers described the blaze as of suspicious origin, possibly set to eliminate evidence of wrongdoing. Whether these were indeed the Peyton women remains unconfirmed. In 1960, the classified files related to the Moundsville case were scheduled for review under state archival protocols. The reviewing committee, composed of officials from the Department of Corrections, State Police, and Attorney General's office, debated whether to maintain restrictions or allow the information to become public. Meeting minutes show a divided opinion, with law enforcement representatives arguing for disclosure in the interest of historical truth, while corrections officials warned about irreparable damage to public trust in state institutions. The deadlock was broken by the discovery of a series of letters in the personal effects of former Warden Samuel Davis, who had died in 1931. These letters, exchanged between Davis and various state officials between 1902 and 1904, confirmed what investigators had long suspected. Davis had not only been aware of the Peyton women's activities, but had actively facilitated them. In a particularly damning letter to State Senator William Harrison, dated January 1903, Davis wrote, "The research conducted by the Peyton sisters has yielded remarkable results. Inmate compliance has increased dramatically, while costly disciplinary measures have been reduced by nearly 60%. I believe their methods represent the future of correction science, despite certain regrettable casualties. Senator Harrison, I must emphasize the importance of your continued protection regarding this program. The public, with its sentimental notions about criminal rehabilitation, would never understand the practical necessities of managing these animals." The discovery of these letters shifted the committee's position, recognizing that the case implicated not just prison staff, but elected officials. They unanimously voted to extend the classification period for an additional 30 years. However, one member of the committee, Assistant Attorney General Richard Bennett, disagreed with this decision. In 1967, Bennett anonymously provided copies of key documents to historian Martin Holloway, who was researching a book on prison reform. Holloway's subsequent publication, Shadows of Moundsville, Institutional Corruption and Abuse in the American Prison System, included a chapter on the Peyton case that brought the story to public attention for the first time. The book received little mainstream notice, but became influential in academic circles studying criminal justice reform. Bennett's role as the source was not revealed until after his death in 1972, when his personal papers included a confession explaining his actions. I could not in good conscience allow this history to be buried. The men who suffered and died deserved at least the dignity of acknowledgement, if not justice. And without confronting such horrors honestly, we risk their repetition. The aftermath of the Moundsville revelations extended well beyond the immediate investigation. In 1968, groundskeeping work at the prison cemetery uncovered an unmarked mass grave containing the partial remains of at least 14 individuals. Forensic examination determined these remains dated from the 1900 to 1905 period. Most significantly, the bones showed unusual chemical residues consistent with the compounds identified in the Peyton laboratory. More disturbing was evidence that the bodies had been subjected to some form of processing before burial, with cut marks suggesting systematic dissection or tissue removal. This discovery prompted the West Virginia legislature to establish a special commission to review all deaths at state facilities between 1890 and 1950. The commission's work was hampered by incomplete records and institutional resistance, but its final report in 1969 documented patterns of suspicious mortality at several facilities beyond Moundsville. The report concluded that a culture of experimentation on vulnerable populations, conducted with tacit official approval, had existed to some degree throughout the early 20th century. When the Moundsville Penitentiary finally closed its doors in 1995, the building's future became a subject of debate. Some advocated for its preservation as a historical site, while others argued it should be demolished to erase the physical reminder of its dark history. Ultimately, the structure was preserved and repurposed as a museum and tourist attraction. Tour guides present sanitized versions of the prison's history, focusing on famous inmates and escape attempts. The story of the Peyton women and their macabre experiments is not part of the standard narrative shared with visitors. Only occasionally does a guide, when asked about the most disturbing aspects of the prison's past, mention rumors about experiments in the old kitchen. As for academic interest in the case, it remains primarily confined to specialized fields. Medical historians have studied the Peyton women's notebooks for what they reveal about early neuropharmacology, despite the horrific methods employed. Criminal justice scholars cite the case as an example of how institutional power can enable and conceal systematic abuse. Occasionally, visitors to the former penitentiary report unusual experiences in the vicinity of where the kitchen once stood: sudden temperature drops, unexplained nausea, or a persistent smell of herbs that cannot be sourced. Staff dismiss these as the power of suggestion, affecting tourists already primed for a haunting experience. Perhaps the most poignant postscript to the story came in 1977, when Anna Reeves, the 87-year-old daughter of guard Thomas Reeves, donated her father's personal effects to the Marshall County Historical Society. Among his possessions was a sealed envelope marked "To be opened after my death." Inside was a single-page confession written in 1932, shortly before Reeves died. It read simply, "I knew what they were doing. We all did. We told ourselves it was for the greater good, using the worst of men to find ways to control the worst in all men. I watched them serve that meat, knowing where it came from. I said nothing. I did nothing. God forgive me, for I cannot forgive myself." In September 2002, exactly 100 years after the Peyton women vanished from Moundsville, Dr. Elaine Chambers, a professor of medical ethics at Johns Hopkins University, published an article titled "The Legacy of Unethical Experimentation: From Moundsville to Modern Research Protocols." Chambers, who specialized in the history of medical abuses in institutional settings, had spent years researching the Peyton case. Her interest was more than academic. Family records had confirmed that Dr. Ellsworth Chambers, one of the central figures in the Moundsville experiments, was her great-grandfather's brother. This connection to such darkness is not something I discovered until midway through my career, she wrote. The realization that my own family history intersected with one of the cases I had studied as an example of ethical failure was profoundly disturbing. It compelled me to understand not just what happened, but how intelligent, educated people justified such horrors to themselves. Dr. Chambers gained special permission to access the complete Moundsville files, including materials still restricted from public view. What she found suggested that the scope of the experiments went beyond what had previously been documented. The Peyton women's ultimate goal, as outlined in their later notes, was not merely behavioral control, but what they termed consciousness modification, the ability to fundamentally alter how subjects perceived and interacted with reality. The compounds they developed apparently produced not just docility, but heightened suggestibility, and in some cases, complete personality transformation. Most disturbing to Dr. Chambers was evidence that the research did not end with the Peyton women's disappearance from Moundsville. References in their notes to continuing work at other sites suggested the experiments merely relocated. Correspondence between Margaret Peyton and Ellsworth Chambers as late as 1908 discussed applications of our methodology in both institutional and public settings. This raised the chilling possibility that their work had evolved from isolated prison experiments to something with broader targets. In the conclusion of her article, Dr. Chambers wrote, "The most insidious aspect of the Moundsville case is not just the experiments themselves, but how easily they were accommodated within an institutional framework. Officials who would never have conducted such research themselves nevertheless permitted it, protected it, and buried evidence of it for decades. This pattern of institutional complicity is not unique to Moundsville. It emerges whenever we dehumanize any population, seeing them as means rather than ends, as experimental subjects rather than persons. The true horror of Moundsville is not that monsters walked its corridors, but that ordinary people became monstrous through a gradual erosion of ethical boundaries, justified by a vision of progress that placed knowledge above humanity. The shadows of Moundsville stretch long across the decades. In 2018, during renovation work on a Victorian house on Jefferson Avenue, the very home once occupied by the Peyton women, contractors made an unexpected discovery. Behind a wall in the basement, they found a small metal box, its lock corroded by time. Inside was a journal, its pages brittle with age. The handwriting matched samples preserved in the state archives, identified as belonging to Eleanor Peyton, the youngest of the three women. The journal contained entries dated between August 1902 and October 1902, the final weeks before their disappearance. Unlike their clinical notes, this journal revealed something of Eleanor's personal thoughts. August 17, 1902. M says we are close to perfecting the formula. The last three subjects responded exactly as predicted. R is concerned about the increasing dosages required for maintained effect, but M believes this is merely a question of refinement. Dr. C's latest letter suggests incorporating components from successful subjects may create a self-perpetuating cycle. The elegance of this solution appeals to us all. Nothing wasted, everything contributing to the advancement of our knowledge. September 2, 1902, Subject 27 expired this morning. M is disappointed but says his contributions will not be wasted. R will prepare the special stock for tomorrow's meal. I sometimes wonder about the ethics of our methods, but as M reminds us, these men are society's discards. Their lives have meaning now that they never would have had otherwise. They are part of something larger than themselves. Literally, in some cases. October 12, 1902. M says we must prepare to leave. She has made arrangements with Dr. C for us to continue our work elsewhere, where appreciation for its significance will be greater. I will miss our little house, but not this provincial town with its suspicious glances and limited understanding. M says the work we have begun here will change the world in ways no one can imagine. That when we perfect our methods, the very nature of human society can be reshaped. Those who consume our preparations become more pliable, more accepting of authority, less troubled by the contradictions and injustices that normally cause such social friction. Imagine a world where such harmony could be achieved through simple dietary supplementation. Is that not worth any price? The final entry, dated October 16, 1902, the day before Inspector Mitchell's visit, reads, "Everything is in readiness. The essential materials have been packed for transport. M has arranged for our departure tomorrow night after our shift ends. The special batch has been prepared for the morning meal, our parting gift to Moundsville. M says it contains our most potent formulation yet. Those who consume it will experience a profound transformation of consciousness." R laughs and says they will carry a piece of us with them forever. How true that is, though they will never know it. And so our work here concludes, but our greater work continues, as May says, we have only just begun to explore the possibilities of reshaping humanity one meal at a time. Today, the West Virginia State Penitentiary stands as a tourist attraction, its Gothic architecture drawing visitors interested in history, architecture, and the macabre. The guided tours mention famous inmates, dramatic escape attempts, and executions carried out within its walls. But they rarely speak of the Peyton women, or the kitchen where they conducted their terrible work. That part of the building was completely remodeled in later renovations, its original layout lost to time. The documents related to the case remain in various archives, some still restricted, others forgotten in boxes, rarely requested by researchers. The names of the men who unknowingly participated in the Peyton experiments, both as direct subjects and as consumers of the contaminated food, are largely lost to history, their suffering unacknowledged. Occasionally, a visitor to the prison museum will report an unusual experience, a sudden, inexplicable nausea in the area where the kitchen once stood, or a peculiar herbal smell that seems to follow them through certain corridors. Staff attribute these reactions to the power of suggestion, the mind creating physical responses to the atmospheric setting. Few connect these sensations to events that unfolded over a century ago. In 2020, a researcher examining soil samples from the prison grounds as part of an environmental study found unusual chemical concentrations in the area of the former kitchen garden. When analyzed, these compounds were identified as degraded residues of various alkaloids consistent with the plants mentioned in the Peyton notes, belladonna, digitalis, and others, with known neurological effects. This suggests that the soil itself retains some chemical memory of what was once cultivated there. The story of the Peyton women and their menu serves as a dark reminder of how institutions can enable and conceal abuses, how ethical boundaries erode when certain lives are deemed less valuable than others, and how history often buries its most disturbing chapters beneath layers of silence and denial. As Eleanor Peyton wrote in her final journal entry, "Those who consume it will carry a piece of us with them forever." In more ways than one, the legacy of what happened at Moundsville continues to be digested, processed, and incorporated into our understanding of human capacity for both scientific inquiry and moral failure. The menu that no one questioned has, in the end, forced us to question much about ourselves.